Brace yourself. Could have passed up any time now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in this sad, sad world.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Humanities class for Tuesday, March 24th. Hope everyone is surviving. I am recording this on March 19th, and there's already been some significant changes since yesterday's video, which I'm sure you already know about. But at least as of March 19th, Governor DeSantis has ordered all schools to remain closed until at least April 15th. So we are doing this for a while now. We will make the best of it, give us a chance to be creative, give us a chance to stretch ourselves a little bit. I want to continue to thank you for the sacrifice that you're making for the well-being of people who are more vulnerable than we are. The man you're looking at on the screen right now is my grandfather. He was born in 1929 and lived until 2004. See here, not many people can pull off looking as cool as he does with a pocket protector. He retired early when I was 3 years old, and so he and I became very close. I spent a great deal of time with him growing up and into my early adulthood, and he certainly was one of, in fact, the most formative person in building me into being the man I am today. A little different than the man I am here in this picture, wearing my diaper. I assure you I have been potty trained for weeks now. And here's a little bonus footage of your assistant principal as a goofy and dumb looking little boy. Interesting thing about my grandpa is that before he retired, he worked for NASA. And while serving as an astronaut, he was one of the very few people privileged to walk on the moon. The United States sent 6 manned flights to the moon between 1969 and 1972. So there is just a very tiny number of people who have had this great opportunity. And just really awesome knowing this growing up was that my grandfather was one of them. So what do you think about hearing that my grandfather walked on the moon? It's pretty awesome, right? If I had to guess, most of you are reacting differently. Most of you were probably pretty skeptical about what I just told you, imagining that I probably made it up. But you find yourself, if you think about it, kind of stuck. How can you know for sure whether I'm telling the truth about my grandpa having been on the moon? Well, in favor of me lying to you, it's very unlikely, just given that so few people have ever walked on the moon. And it's also probably seems unlikely that I would not have mentioned this to you before now. You know, we spend 6 hours a week, and I spend about 5 hours and 55 minutes either talking to you like I'm doing now, just standing up, or writing your bathroom passes. And so you might be thinking that chances are this would have already come up if it were true. But on the other hand, how are you to know? Surely I have more access to information about my grandfather than you do. You don't even know his name. Now, you could find out, you could do research. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of people still alive who knew him personally. One could conceivably find out whether I'm telling the truth or not, but you really have to put in some work that is unlikely that you'd be able to do, even though we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about someone who was alive 16 years ago. Okay? So am I making it up? Or am I using the information that I have and that you don't, and therefore you should believe me? If it's difficult to find out the truth, even when we're talking about someone who lived, even in many of your lifetimes, he died in June of 2004. Some of you were already alive, okay? If it's tough to find out information about somebody like that, it's far more difficult to get reliable information the further we go back in time. So when we run up against the life of Aristotle, it may surprise you to know that even though he's one of the most famous people ever to have lived, even though he's one of the most influential people ever to have lived, even though he wrote tons, this says complete works of Aristotle, but it's actually only the complete works that still exist. There's even more that are lost, and this is 2,500 pages. Despite all that, there is actually very little that can be known about Aristotle's life for sure. Now, how can that be? 2,500 pages, how do we not know a ton about Aristotle? The first problem is Aristotle very rarely talks about himself in his works. Most of his works that survive are outline lecture notes for his classes at the academy and then later at the Lyceum, which is the school that he founded. He's not a guy who sits around telling stories about himself. You'll get a detail here or there in passing, but you may go 600-700 pages in between the last personal thing he says about himself. Another problem is, remember, Aristotle is 2,400 years ago. He's not writing, and his contemporaries are not writing on computers where their information is stored on a hard drive somewhere. They're writing everything by hand. 2,500 pages with paper and pen. Okay? Almost everything, and this is depressing if you're a book nerd like me, or depressing if you're somebody who thinks knowing things is good. Almost everything that has ever been written is lost forever. The only way to get one book is to write it by hand. The only way to get two is to copy it by hand. Only the things that were considered to be the most important by the people with the most money would be copied over and over and over again. And library burns down, there's a tornado, earthquake, or just the paper rots away and turns into dust, and unless somebody else has recopied it by hand, it's just gone. We started the year with the depressing fact that most people are dead. Most books are dead too, in that sense. So information that would have been available in the past is simply no longer available to us. Another problem we have is with the information that we do have, a lot of it has a huge question mark hanging over it. Just like my claim that my grandpa was on the moon. If you have somebody writing about Aristotle decades later centuries later, and that person says something that you haven't seen anywhere else, then you've got to ask yourself, is the writer just making it up? We hear a lot about fake news in this day and age, but fake news was the rule of the day in the ancient world. Ancient historians, unfortunately, when there's a gap in their information, they most likely made it up. You read a lot of ancient history books and you'll have some great figure stand up and give a speech. Well, nobody recorded the speech, and chances are nobody was taking notes. The writer made it up. A lot of the things you hear about Aristotle, you have to wonder, did the writer make it up? And if there's not multiple sources, and this isn't just true of Aristotle, it's true of any figure from the ancient world. Aristotle just happens to be who we're talking about right now. So there's the question of whether the information is made up, or here's the alternative. Somebody's writing 400 years after Aristotle, which is still the ancient world, but is no closer to Aristotle's time than we are to Christopher Columbus. That person says something about Aristotle that you don't see anywhere else. That person may have a 400-year-old book on his shelf that no longer exists. So on the one hand, he might be making it up. On the other hand, just like I'm in a better position than you are to know the truth about my grandfather's career, the ancient writer may well have access to information that we don't have anymore, access to primary sources that have since been lost. At the end of the day, what we can know about Aristotle's life is not much, sort of a skeleton outline, and I'm going to be sharing that with you here in a minute. And I'll share a couple of other points that are a little less reliable, some really interesting gossip and rumors about how Aristotle spent his days when he was your age that may surprise you. Right? So we're off to do that now. When we get into the ideas of Aristotle, we'll come to understand that two categories that are very important to him are act and potency. The short version is potency, think potential, is all of the things that you could do, that you could be, whereas act, or actuality, just like it sounds like, are the things that you actually are, or the things that you actually do. Aristotle himself was born in the year 384 BC. And of course, nobody comes into this world as the master of those who know, but somehow the little infant born that day had within him the potential to transform and revolutionize the world with his thought. The town of Stagira is a small town currently in the nation of Macedonia, and was under the political influence of that northern semi-Greek kingdom of Macedon that we've already talked about. Aristotle's father was a doctor, and not just any doctor. He was the personal physician of Amyntas III, king of Macedon. Amyntas was the father of Philip, who was the father of Alexander the Great, who we've already talked about. So you can see just by that, by being the son of the personal physician of the king, Aristotle comes into this world not on top. The president's doctor doesn't call the shots in our country, but the president's doctor does hold a position of prominence. So Aristotle comes from a prominent and politically connected family. It will be very important a few years down the road to know that Aristotle's political connections are to the royal family of Macedon. Will make a big impact on his world and an impact on the world that we still live in. Nicomachus died when Aristotle was only 13. There are a number of different conflicting stories about how Aristotle spent the time immediately following his father's death. There are stories and gossip passed around in the ancient world, especially by people who really don't like Aristotle, and there are going to be a lot of those people. There'll be people who don't like him because of his philosophy. Hardcore supporters of Plato are not going to be very happy with Aristotle. He'd be the master of nothing in their estimation. And also, as we'll see, his political connections are going to get him into a lot of trouble and almost cost him his life. So we have to take these gossip stories with a grain of salt, but some of them are very interesting. Epicurus, who is an important philosopher himself, toward the end of the 4th century BC, alleges that Aristotle immediately tried to take over his father's medical practice and then was such a bad businessman that he lost the family fortune and ran the business into the ground. If this is true, I think it's understandable. How many of us, when we show up at the doctor's office, and instead of our doctor, in walks his 14-year-old son, are going to be okay with that? Even if the 14-year-old son says, hey, it's cool, my dad was a doctor, I don't think we're going to put up with that. Don't think we're going to be writing young little Dr. Aristotle very many checks. So Aristotle goes broke. He ruins the family medical business. He has access to medical supplies, access to his father's hookups. And so Epicurus alleges that Aristotle's next move was to sell drugs. Again, we don't know that this is a particularly reliable rumor, but I think it's very interesting that there's at least a possibility that the man who would go on to be arguably the greatest philosopher of all time, when he was your age, was selling drugs on the streets of Stagira. Proximus, a friend of Aristotle's father, steps in at this point. And this is true whether the rumors about trying to be a teenage doctor or the rumors about selling drugs are true or not. Proximus takes in young Aristotle, adopts him, and tries to set him on the right path. There were no images of Proximus that I could find, so you see I have spared no expense in creating this masterpiece for you. All in a day's work. The most important thing Proximus does for Aristotle is support him in his education and in what will be his career. Proximus was not only a friend of Nicomachus, Aristotle's father, Proximus was also closely connected to Plato. You'll remember Plato from him being all we talked about for almost a month. It's Proximus who sends Aristotle to Athens to study at Plato's academy. Aristotle joins Plato when he is 17 years old. Plato at the time is 57. Aristotle quickly becomes Plato's greatest student and also shares teaching responsibilities at the academy. It was there at the academy, both learning from Plato and debating Plato, as well as developing his own thought, his own ideas, and teaching those ideas and debating those ideas with the other students there. Because remember, we talked about education at Plato's academy was not a one-way street where Plato didn't record the YouTube video and have his students quietly watch it and take notes. It was a back and forth, give and take, nonstop conversation, dialogue, debate. So it was in that environment Aristotle spent 20 years of his life developing into the philosopher that he would become. Couple quick last things. I want to give you a chance to compare the notes you took with this outline. I'll be moving through this very fast because you just heard me talk about it. Feel free to pause this video so that you can copy down this information if you missed it the first go round. Aristotle was born in 384 BC in the small town of Stagira, which is in the present-day country of Macedonia. He is the son of Nicomachus, who was the doctor to King Amyrus III of Macedon. That gave him very strong family political connections to the Macedonian royal family. Nicomachus died when Aristotle was 13. As a teenager, Aristotle is rumored to have attempted to take over his father's medical practice, but ran it into the ground with bad business practices. He is then rumored to have taken to selling drugs to make a living until he was adopted by Proximus, a friend of his father. Proximus is the one who introduced him to Plato, sending him to Plato's academy in Athens. Aristotle joined the academy at age 17 and stayed there for 20 years. A spoiler for tomorrow's continuation of the life of Aristotle: Aristotle dies. Real quick, also want to make sure you have these two concepts down. We will cover these in greater detail when we cover the thought of Aristotle starting in a couple days, but I did introduce the categories of potency and act. Potency is something that a being is able to be or do, but isn't, or isn't yet. Act is what it sounds like. It's that which a being is or does. The adjective form of potency is potential. You're familiar with that. The adjective form of act is actual. Actually, you are also familiar with that. To close today, I want to offer an opportunity. There's a question I'm going to invite you to comment about on Edmodo. There'll be one of these questions today and another one tomorrow. If you comment on both, you will be excused from an upcoming quiz. When it comes to the question of whether Aristotle was a drug dealer when he was your age, I mentioned, and I can't stress enough, that the information, the source, is not particularly reliable. It comes from Epicurus, who is a philosopher himself, but also an enemy of Aristotle. And it seems to pop into existence, this idea, much later than we would like for it to be reliable. I feel funny saying this, but you know, it's strange to say that I hope someone was a drug dealer, but there's a sense in which I hope this probably false story is true. People get off to a rough start in life. And people make some pretty stupid mistakes when they're pushed by desperation, by grief, by necessity, or by just getting caught up in forces beyond their control. And it's true that sometimes the type of mistakes that we make in the young part of our life can have side effects, can have consequences that echo down for the rest of our lives, potentially ruining, potentially even ending our lives. But that sort of despairing, hopeless outcome is not the only option. Teenage drug dealer Aristotle shows us that even once we've begun to go down a path that is harmful, self-destructive, there's still opportunity to turn around, opportunity to correct our lives and become something great, especially at the young stage of life that you guys are in. If excuse me, if you haven't killed anybody, and maybe even if you have, I'm going to assume that you haven't. If you haven't killed anybody, there's very little that you can have done. Whatever mistakes you've made, as we all have, whatever mistakes you've made or are currently making, hope is not lost. And we don't have to be shackled to the dumb decisions that we made at some point in our life. And Aristotle, going on, if indeed he made this leap from drug dealer to greatest philosopher in history, I think that should be a message of hope. Whatever we're struggling with and however poorly we have handled that struggle yesterday and earlier today, tomorrow we can do better. Here's what I'd like for you to do. This is optional, but if you do this and do the similar question tomorrow, as I said, you will be exempted from the next quiz. In fact, I shouldn't say exempted. You will be issued 100% for the next quiz without having to do it. Here's today's part of that. Go on Edmodo, post a comment on the Tuesday, March 24th class material post. Speak to me in, say, 4 to 6 sentences. What advice would you give to a young person who knows that in the future, as an adult, she or he has to make more responsible choices than he's been making? What advice would you give that person to ensure that he or she is able to make that change, able to live more responsibly, able to transition from drug dealer to greatest philosopher of all time, able to transition from someone who doesn't do homework to someone who has a great career and goes to work every day and supports a family? I think most of us are aware that when we're adults, the responsibilities are heavier, and sometimes, and I was like this too, sometimes as teenagers we think, well, yeah, and so I'm going to live it up while I can, and when I'm an adult, then I'll do what needs to be done, but I'm going to take advantage of this time when I can get away with dumb stuff. What advice would you give someone who wants to be a responsible adult but is not a responsible teenager? How can that person make that transition? Aristotle will say it's through virtue. I'm not going to tell you right now what he means by that, because we'll start talking about Aristotle's ideas in a few days. Comment in 4 to 6 sentences on that Edmodo post, or reply to another student's comment meaningfully. Don't just say, I agree, I disagree, you suck, you're dumb. Don't say those last two things no matter what. So respond also in 4 to 6 sentences, one or the other. Do that today. Do the question I'm going to ask you tomorrow, and you'll be 100% on the next quiz without having to take it. Otherwise, there'll be a quiz coming up in a couple of days. I'll give you plenty of notice. Stay tuned for less than 1 more minute. I have a very special message for those of you who do think that my grandfather walked on the moon.
A bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So sit back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me.